Ludwig van Beethoven was born on December 16, 1770, in Bonn. The son of a dissolute court musician, Beethoven was a child prodigy who first gained fame as a pianist, the greatest of his time. Upon settling in Vienna in 1792, he was acclaimed by the city's music-loving aristocracy. Unlike such predecessors as Mozart and Haydn, Beethoven demanded that his wealthy patrons respect his rights as an artist. He knew he was writing for eternity, and as a creator considered himself superior to kings and nobles. This utter conviction in his own talent, coupled with a forceful personality, enabled Beethoven to dictate to life on his own terms in almost everything except his tragic deafness, which began when he was 30. By 1817, he was profoundly deaf, yet some of his strongest works were composed in the last 10 years of his life, culminating in 1824 in the monumental Ninth Symphony. After a long illness, Beethoven died on March 27, 1827, at age 56. An innovator in every musical form in which he worked, Beethoven was instrumental in the development of the piano sonata as a vehicle for expressing the composer's boldest and most inward thoughts. He was perhaps the greatest improviser in music, and his techniques revolutionized sonata structure.
It's my pleasure to welcome you to The Nature of Genius, which is a series of programs about that very thing, genius as we find it in music. Today, I hope to do a very contradictory sort of thing, and that is to, at once, demystify Beethoven, and at the same time, explain to you why I think he deserves some degree of deity or deification about him and his life and his music. So this seems to be a little bit contradictory, but I think there's a way that we can understand the growth in his intelligence, the growth in his creative output, in a way that makes him much more human, not more than human, in a way that makes him part of our experience as human beings when we are very excellent, when we are very smart, and also a way of looking at this individual who, like all of us, and whatever our endeavors are, we struggle toward excellence. And indeed, this is something he did, and did very often, and did very well. So these are two contradictory ideas I'd hope to leave you with, and that is the plainness, the humanness of Ludwig van Beethoven, and also the magnificence of an individual, another human, who seeks to be better than what he could be without that effort. I want to do this by examining two very special works. They are both piano sonatas. The first, which appears at the beginning of his career, that is the Sonata in F minor, Opus 2, number 1, published 1796. And I'd like to look then at the very last piano sonata that Beethoven composed and published, the Opus 111 in C minor, published 1822. And by choosing these two works, we can take a look at the expanse of his compositions from the very beginning, when he is still studying with Franz Joseph Haydn, to the very end, or toward the very end of his life, when the mature, full-flowered Ludwig van Beethoven genius is afoot. But first, Beethoven is, in a sense, a victim, if not a subject of his own circumstance, of his own time. His two principal teachers were Franz Joseph Haydn and Johann Albrechtsberger. And I attribute the teachings of these two to the creation of the Beethoven mature sound idea, because you can see the influence very early on. The Opus 2, number 1 piano sonata is dedicated to Franz Joseph Haydn, but it also reveals something of Haydn's teaching. There's a clear adherence to the sonata tradition. It is in 4 movements. Many of Haydn's 52 piano sonatas are also in 4 movements. It is a model kind of piece. At the same time, Beethoven is launching his own professional career and also paying homage to the tradition of the classicists, particularly Haydn and Mozart, in the composition of this particular piece, Opus 2, number 1. It has all of the characteristics of the classical sonata. It has some of the daring that we will see in the more mature Beethoven, but it presents this break from his student days to the beginning of his professional career. From Haydn and Mozart and the classical tradition, we see a very clear adherence to traditions of form, and in particular to the sonata form. Sonata form is kind of a box. There are very specific procedures that must be followed. There are very specific steps that must be taken for a movement or a work to be called a sonata. Yet at the same time, Beethoven is attempting to fuse in some elements from the Haydn, Mozart tradition and some elements that he is groping to discover in his middle and later works. From Albrechtsberger, Beethoven studied that dreaded thing called counterpoint. The tradition of J.S. Bach, the idea of the study of voices moving around one another. If there's a counterpoint composition in what's called fourth species, that essentially means there are four voices, four violins perhaps, or four oboes perhaps, that follow one another. Voice 1 will take up the melody, voice 2 will follow that, voice 3, and so on. Hence, a fugue, the contrapuntal technique. Albrechtsberger was Beethoven's teacher in Vienna of this technique. We'll see that influence of Johann Albrechtsberger in the later works of Ludwig van Beethoven, particularly in the last string quartets and the last piano sonatas, because just about each one of those has a fugue, or a very prodigious involvement in the contrapuntal technique, this idea of voices following one another, which is at odds with what is the classical technique of music written in the harmonic format as opposed to a contrapuntal format. These are all fancy words, but I think after you've heard both works, Opus 2 number 1 and the grand Opus 111 Sonata, I think it'll be very clear where we can see the influence of Franz Joseph Haydn early on and the influence of Albrechtsberger later on in the latter works of Beethoven. There's a third influence, and it's an influence coming from someone that Ludwig van Beethoven never met. That person is the second son of Johann Sebastian Bach, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. And that influence comes primarily from the compositions, in particular a set of piano sonatas by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach entitled the Prussian Sonatas. These are influential in that they set out a dramatic paradigm for sonata writing that Ludwig van Beethoven starts to inculcate into his music round about the Pathetique Sonata, Opus 13. And the dramatic element in C.P.E. Bach's sonatas has to do with this idea of starting a movement and then suddenly coming to a stop, placing a fermata or a pause, having sudden shifts in the dynamic texture of the composition, having sudden shifts in the tempo or the speed that a composition proceeds, this idea of dramatic concepts, this idea of being off-footed, having a very fast opening passage followed by a very slow passage within the same movement. This dramatic element, in a sense, is emblematic of the Rococo influence on C.P.E. Bach, and certainly this is picked up by Beethoven, as we will see in Opus 111, these sudden stops, these sort of fitful, emotionally fitful beginnings and pauses that take place in Opus 111. And again, this primarily comes from C.P.E. Bach. We know this because Beethoven had written a number of letters and in his diaries, comments about the influence of C.P.E. Bach on his music. Now again, this is a person that he never met, but someone who clearly is starting to peck away at the tradition, at least in terms of how Beethoven is handling this thing called the sonata. And keep in mind, we can use the sonata, particularly the piano sonata, to describe this evolution in Beethoven's work because it expands its entire career. From the fourth composition he published, which is what I'm going to talk about and play, to almost the very last composition he published, Opus 111, we can see how this development is taking place. You can do the same sort of study following the string quartets. There are not quite as many. You can make the same sort of study with the 10 symphonies. There are, again, not quite as many. Here we have an expanse of 32 sonatas, a particular genre in which Beethoven specialized, and we can see this growth from the Haydnesque classicist involvement to the more romantic, shall I say, involvement in Opus 111. Now this sonata, this very first sonata published in 1796, has a great deal to do with Sturm und Drang, this Germanic concept of storm and stress, this idea of tension, a kind of debate between form and content. And at this point, form is winning out. We're very well aware of sonata form of the first movement. We are very aware of the binary form two-part form of the second movement. And certainly we're very well aware in listening to the third movement of the minuet trio, the dance form of the third movement. So in a sense, this reliance on form has a great deal to do with where he's coming from, this tutelage of Haydn, the influence of Mozart, and to some degree the influence of C.P.E. Bach in wanting to make the form apparent. No mysteries, no obfuscation, nothing indelicate about it whatsoever. In the first movement, it's very clear that Beethoven is designing an organic sonata. By that I mean a sonata whose elements are interrelated. The first theme has an organic relationship to the second theme. The second theme has an organic relationship to all the modulations, the change of keys that take place throughout the sonata. The coda, the very ending of the first movement, is related in part to the first theme. That this sonata is a very organic kind of etude almost, an etude in form, a study in form, the manipulation and making apparent the arms, the limbs, the legs, the neck, the cheek, so to speak, of how the piece is put together. I'd like to give you an example of how this works in this sonata. This work is dedicated to Haydn, and if he's going to dedicate it to Haydn, he had better make sure Haydn was going to like it, or at least make sure that it was more than a dedication in words, but a dedication in content and form. And in that sense, I think we can look at this piece as a work that shows the influence of classicists on Beethoven, because he's following all the rules. He's following them rather inventively, but he's following all the rules nonetheless. And what are the rules? A sonata, as described by Haydn, 52 sonatas, Mozart's more than 24 sonatas, has a very particular format. And genius isn't laid in the form. Genius is laid in how you handle this form. A sonata has to do a couple things. There must be an exposition or a beginning that has certain properties. There must be a development section where those properties are manipulated in some clever, hopefully clever way, and a recapitulation, or a section that reprises the very beginning. So the overall format of sonata form is three-part. Exposition that has certain events that must take place, development of those events. If the first theme is 10 measures long, then a development element might be that to manipulate the first theme to be only 4 measures long. If the second theme is in minor, a developmental activity might be to put the second theme in major. Left hand, right hand, backwards. And then the recapitulation. Now, within the exposition, very specific things must take place. There must be a first theme, some kind of transition, which is typically called an episode, a second theme, in contrast to the first theme, and a coda, a little short characteristic ending. Then you begin your development. In Beethoven's case, and at least in the case of Opus 2, number 1, he wants to follow all of these procedures to show his teacher, Haydn, that yes, I can handle this material, yet at the same time inject something clever, something unique into this. Part of the struggle that's going on in his own mind between form and content has to do with Haydn and Beethoven at this point. The characteristic of the first theme is what's called a Mannheim rocket. Mannheim was not only a city, but it was a gathering of composers, most principal of which was a composer named Stamitz, who attempted to place names and characteristics to certain musical gestures. The Mannheim rocket sounds like it plays. In this case, it sounds like this. An ascending arpeggio, this kind of lifting experience like a rocket. The Beethoven Sonata's first theme, Opus 2, number 1, is a Mannheim rocket. The second theme of this first movement is, and I think even the most novice music listener can figure out what the relationship is between the first theme, Mannheim rocket, and the second theme. They're opposites. As the first theme rises, with this short little turn at the end, the second theme descends with the turn at the end. Now, Haydn figured that out, certainly. He saw that this young fellow, Ludwig van Beethoven, was a pretty clever guy. He's tied these two elements together by making them the mirror image of each other. But the transition between these two is also an organic element of this sonata, in that the transition sounds like this. We're at the second theme. The transition uses the tiniest part, the tiniest fraction of the first theme, and that is this little piece that my daughter calls the burp. The transition exploits that short little gesture. Classic example of a classicist taking fragments, perhaps the tiniest fragment of a theme, in this case the first theme, to build 30 seconds worth of music. The sense of architecture, the sense of form being preeminent, dominates this entire sonata, and this is a wonderful example of how Beethoven's mind is working. I can imagine that he had placed his score on this wall very much like this, and took little razor blades and clipped out little pieces, intellectually, clipped out little pieces to figure, let's see, I can develop this in some clever way. I'll put that on the side. I'll save that. I want to re-inject that into the veins of this sonata in some clever way. That his mind is working in these kind of architectural ways, not unlike poets of the period, not unlike painters, certainly, of a prior period in Europe, that he's thinking about the design, how the very last measure of this first movement is going to relate to the very first measure of the movement. That this sense of form is to be apparent. Certainly Haydn picked up on this mirror imaging idea and these fragments that keep reappearing. But it is to be apparent. There is no obfuscation. There is no attempt to bury the piece, to bury his form underneath a great deal of content and expression. The expression is inherent in the intelligibility of the form. Now, when we get to Opus 111, we'll see that that paradigm is perhaps twisted on its head, where the expression is the form, as opposed to the form being the vehicle for the expression. As we look at the second movement, and again, to jump across all of the other wonderful things that happen in the first movement, the second movement is perhaps the simplest to comprehend. It is simply a song, a slow movement adagio song. It sounds something like this. There is a middle section that is in the relative minor, or in this case, D minor. There's a harmonic relationship of the sections in this movement. And this tune, this wonderful melody, returns in an even more embroidered fashion. Very simple, very straightforward. That is not to say that it is not important, but the element of its form, the simplicity of its form, is utterly apparent. While it is a simple form, it is also a form that is expected to be apparent to you on first listening. The third movement is perhaps the movement most closely connected with dance form. Keep in mind that all of these forms, even in the hands of the Baroque, J.S. Bach, were emanated from the dance tradition, the gavotte, the minuet. And in this case, Beethoven is clearly drawing from that resource in the design of the minuet movement number 3. This movement proceeds on with its minuet interruption, then a return to this opening melody and theme. It has a naughtiness about it that perhaps is, again, tribute to Haydn. If Haydn's sonatas are characteristic for anything, they're characteristic for their sense of form, certainly, but they're also characteristic for their sense of humor. And Beethoven certainly inherits that naughtiness, that kind of jocularity, and puts it into this movement. There are a number of bumps. There are a number of sforzandi, accent marks, coming at odd beats. Instead of being primarily on the downbeat where you would normally expect to, in a dance, place your foot, these accents come on the place where your foot is not supposed to be. This sense of rhythmic naughtiness is certainly inherent in this movement. And it's giving the movement a sense of motion, forward motion, and also a sense of stammering effect. The last movement of Opus 2, number 1, again harkens back to the ferocity of the first movement. It is an in-your-face kind of composition. It is essentially very fast, built on a triplet motive of both hands, left and right hand, and essentially is built in a sonata form fashion. It has a first theme, it has a second theme, it has something on the order of a development section, but it is not pure sonata form. It is a combination between sonata form and a rondo type form, and sounds something like this. Proceeds onward into a middle section, has a short type of development, and then this ferocity returns. If you're out of breath, it's okay, so am I. Here we have 4 movements. Sonata is certainly a procedure, a scheduled set of events that can take place. Sonata, in the hands of Beethoven at this point, is homage to a prior tradition, a tradition that he never fully breaks from, but a tradition that he is certainly going to stretch from, and that is the classical tradition of Haydn and Mozart. Sonata is also a cause. It is not just a first theme, a second theme, and digits that have to fall into certain places. It is a format or an excuse for drama. In the case of Opus 2, number 1, we see a young 25-year-old composer struggling with this issue of what is handed to him from his culture, from his society, what is handed to him by geniuses in their own right, and also what he wants to bring into the musical tradition, wanting to pay homage to the past and also invent the future. And that is, in part, the struggle of the genius of Ludwig van Beethoven. How do you do both? How do you contradict the past? How do you go forward? Is part of this adventure that takes place between the first sonata, Opus 2, number 1, and the very last piano sonata of Ludwig van Beethoven, Opus 111. In a moment, I'm going to perform Opus 2, number 1, and I think we can at least lay the groundwork for this struggle that is going to take place. Now that we've encountered the very first piano sonata by Ludwig van Beethoven, Opus 2, number 1, perhaps you have some questions or comments about the work.
Yes, Provost Lytle, I was wondering if the style of Beethoven's other piano sonatas follow more closely to that of his first or his last.
There are 32 sonatas, and they evolve. I think they fall fairly clearly in 3 distinct periods. There's obviously an early, middle, and a late. And many of these early works are going through the evolution of moving from being purely classical sonatas with traditional form-like elements, to being more spontaneous and more almost improvisatory. The middle works are clearly the tempestuous works, the works that are full of a lot of fire and brimstone, and are still involved with form, but are much more freely constructed. There are a number of the middle sonatas that have real questionable movements, meaning a distinct first movement with a beginning and an end, and a very long introduction that introduces the second movement, perhaps, and perhaps a very long ending before that movement is over. So he starts to reshape his concepts of form. And by the last group of sonatas, that concept of form is much more freewheeling. So it's an evolutionary process. There aren't sonatas that are strictly one thing or another, but certainly beginning with this first sonata, we see the adherence to form, and he gradually moves away from that adherence to a more free form in the last works. Yes?
I was curious, there seems to be a lot of highs and lows, like a lot of emphasis in some parts, and yet it's very soft in others. Was Beethoven trying to portray an idea or anything with those starts and stops in his works?
Well, certainly it's an element of the drama. I mean, drama is not about continuous yelling and screaming and impetuousness. It's also about the suspense, the expectation of what is about to happen, the big bang that's about to happen. And again, that element clearly comes from the influence of C.P.E. Bach. And I would suggest, if you can get your hands on a recording of the Prussian sonatas, you'll see that the idea of these stops and starts and the high versus low and themes appearing in both hands, something that starts with C.P.E. Bach. And Beethoven exaggerates, even at this early point, is exaggerating this idea of the surprise and having these accents coming on the off-footed beats. That lends itself toward creating this atmosphere of anxiety and atmosphere of drama. Also, it's important to remember that the piano, the forte piano that Beethoven composed for, was much smaller than our modern-day piano. Now, this particular piano, as you can see, is a Brissendorfer and actually has 97 keys. The Brissendorfer, or Broadwood, that Beethoven performed on at this point in his career, Opus 2, number 1, was much smaller. It didn't have this octave, and there was half an octave that was clipped off the bottom. So he had to compress and condense all of that activity within the range of a much smaller piano. And rather than trying to give you the sense of drama by playing at the outer extremes that we know today, he had to compress those dramatic elements within a much more limited range. So he had to create drama not with range or pitch, but had to create it with dynamics and almost vertically.
Yes, speaking about the differences between the pianos of Beethoven's time and today, how do you feel about period instrument performances?
That's a very interesting question. How do I feel about period instruments? There are performers who feel that you should play a composition from 1792 on a 1792 instrument. I'm not that kind of a purist about this. I think if Beethoven had this instrument, he would play it. He may change the composition to accommodate some of the extravagances, the wonderful extravagances of this instrument. But I don't think the composers were thinking in terms of the instrument before them. They were thinking about a music, certainly in Beethoven's case, thinking about a music that could be. There are passages in middle works of Beethoven where he has written notes that were not on his keyboard. He clearly knew they were not on his keyboard. They were not on the keyboard that was in his home or in any concert hall in Vienna. But that was the music he wanted, and he said, it's your tough luck if you can't play it. Opus 110 is a very good example of that in the middle movements. So I think if he wasn't such a purist about it, I don't think we need to be such a purist about it 180 years later. So yes, I think there's an interesting historical artifact that can be created, recorded, by using a period instrument. But even that period instrument in 1994 is not going to sound like that instrument or its cousin that would have been in existence at the dawn of the 19th century. That we can only guesstimate or get close to recreating that kind of a sound. And again, I think that's for historical purposes. I don't think it's for performance practice purposes. I don't think it tells us anything about performance practice. I think this tells us more. This, performing these 180-year-old works on a modern piano, tells us more about Beethoven's thinking because, again, he was thinking beyond his current state of affairs in terms of instruments.
I was wondering, in his later years, how many pieces did he compose, like sonatas, when he was deaf? And how exactly, do you think he would be able to incorporate all these things and do this without being able to hear his own music?
Well, as I mentioned before, I'm not a purist about this. I don't think his deafness had a great deal to do with the evolution of his compositions. Personally, and emotionally, certainly he was distraught, and you can feel that tension and that distress in the compositions. But I don't think it had much to do with some of the dissonance and chromaticism that emerges in the later works. I think he was going there anyway. It may have been propelled by his deafness and that he wanted to scream in ways that were not possible in strict tonal music. But clearly the last 10 years of his life, he died in 1827, the last 10 years of his life include works that have two emotional arguments. A great deal of stress, storm and stress, and also a kind of groping for the celestial in a way. You will hear in the Opus 111 Sonata, when I discuss and perform that, some of the distress of the first movement, the anguish and the C minor mood that he's created throughout all of his life. And then again in the C major, second movement, where the latter third of the sonata, of that movement, of that sonata, is performed in the top half of the keyboard. There's a sense for having a much lighter sound and texture in these last works that is juxtaposed with those more violent movements. Opus 111 is also a very good example of the kinds of works that have form within form. While the first movement is a sonata form, it also has in it a short fugue. So this idea of almost a Brechtian idea of inserting a form within a form. And again, that's not an issue of a result of his not having hearing. It's a result of his intellectual capacity to think it through. and he certainly could hear it. You can you can, in a sense, answer this question for yourself. If you will, for a moment, think about the tune of Happy Birthday. You can hear that in your head. You know what it sounds like. You know what the interval relationships are. You may not know what they are, but you certainly can hear them. And certainly a skilled musician like Beethoven could hear those interval relationships in his head as he was thinking about a composition. If he's walking through the woods thinking of these melodies without a piano, he can certainly think about them when he's lost his hearing. I mean, so it's not an impossibility. Sure, it's a heck of a lot easier if you do have your hearing. But I don't think the loss of hearing affected the production, the musical production of the works, as much as it affected the anguish that was laden in those works.
Cecil, you told us about the people who influenced Beethoven and the way in which they influenced him. Who did he influence, and how was his tradition carried on, and what effect did he have on the next generation of composers?
Beethoven is the icon for the 19th century, the European 19th century music. Liszt clearly felt that he was carrying forward Beethoven's message. I think he was wrong, but he felt that that model was the model he wished to follow. Mendelssohn, another 19th century composer, tried to recapture this enthusiasm for sonata writing, or writing in sonata form throughout his symphonies and his own sonatas and chamber music. Brahms was quite open in saying that he felt he was returning German music in the latter part of the 19th century to the intellectual and emotional bedrock of Beethoven, and he was at war with some of the more extravagant 19th century composers. There were either the reactions against Beethoven or away from Beethoven, or those who felt that their work were affirmations of Beethoven's compositional life. And Brahms felt that he was returning German music to the fold. Someone like Wagner felt they were running away from that fold and getting more involved in Germanic mysticism, which certainly wasn't an issue for Beethoven. So he served as a model either by those who tried to repeat his era and the importance of his era, or those who tried to run away from it. So clearly the impact was there. And he also had another impact through personal contact, a kind of a generational lineage. Carl Czerny, the famous composer of exercises that you've all suffered through, Carl Czerny was his closest student, an intimate friend in later years. And Czerny did a number of things. One, he wrote a biography about Beethoven, which is not terrifically accurate because it's overly laudatory, perhaps. But he also passed along the teachings of Beethoven, the pianism of Beethoven, to his students. And who were his students? Franz Liszt, primary student at a very young age, who met Beethoven through the contact of Carl Czerny. So this kind of lineage starts with Beethoven through Czerny, through Liszt, from Liszt to Thalberg to Rubinstein here into the 20th century. So clearly that lineage is there, and it's an important lineage because he serves even in the 20th century as a model of organizational thought. How do you organize a composition, whether it's a piano composition or a tape piece? Is it going to be an organic work? Is it going to be referential, drawing material from the various sections? That's a Beethoven issue.